All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy to welcome David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of Trumpocalypse and a friend of the show, a man who needs no introduction. David Frum, good to see you.
Thank you. We're speaking on a grim day.
We are. There's a lot of crazy stuff happening. There's a vice presidential debate coming up. There's a hurricane, people suffering in North Carolina and places like that. But the big story right now, just as we record this, is, of course, having to do with Israel. Tell us, if you would, what is going on and what do we need to know?
Well, I'm going to have to be careful about that because I feel by the time people listen to this, if they do, they will know much more than we do. What we know as of about 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the 1st of October is that Iran has unleashed a ballistic missile barrage at Israel of about 400, it said, missiles. This would be the largest nation-to-nation ballistic attack in the history of the world by far, dramatically more so. All of Israel is within range of these missiles. It's night there, of course, and so people are in bomb shelters. As we speak, we do not know whether anyone in Israel has been hurt. But they have sophisticated anti-missile defenses, but this barrage is so big and is timed in such a way as to overwhelm missile defenses. So it seems not impossible that people could be hurt. The damage could be quite severe. And again, by the time people hear this, they will know whether any of that is true or not. We do not know. So we're going to be discussing this in something of an information vacuum. We'll be talking about hypotheticals.
Well, let me ask you something that I think we can speculate on, maybe, are the domestic political ramifications of this, right? I mean, we have a presidential election in a month, and this is now something that is certainly escalating. We've seen the IDF, target and take out Hezbollah leaders, terrorists, and now this is happening. I don't know where it stops, and what do you think it means for the American domestic political concerns?
Well, will certainly be question number one at the vice presidential debate that is scheduled to open at 9 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time again. Tim Walz, the Democratic candidate for vice president, has very little in the way of foreign policy chops. He has not spoken much on these kinds of issues, and he has expressed himself sometimes in ways that friends of Israel find uncomfortable. That he has professed great friendship for Ilhan Omar, the very anti-Israel member of Congress from Minnesota, but mostly he's a relative abstainer on this complex of issues. J.D. Vance, on the other hand, does have strong foreign policy views, and they are foreign policy views that are mostly extremely hostile to America's allies. He has been the leading opponent of assistance to Ukraine, probably the most compelling voice for the anti-Ukraine policy in the U.S. Senate. I mean, leaving aside marginal characters like Rand Paul, who don't carry a lot of weight, he's the running mate for the Republican ticket, and he has said, "I don't care what happens to Ukraine." He has been very hostile to other allies. Now, he has carved out a special exemption for Israel in very recent months. In May, he delivered a speech affirming his support for assistance to Israel. But if you are someone who listens to these things carefully, it wasn't very reassuring for a bunch of reasons. Reason number one is the speech made no sense. It's very hard to come up with a foreign policy rationale that says, I'm against helping Ukraine, I'm against defending NATO, I'm indifferent to Taiwan, but I make a special exemption for Israel. And the argument he used, which is, and the reason I make an exemption for Israel is because they don't need our help, is not an argument for helping them, it's an argument against helping them. And the last thing that was, I think, ominous to Friends of Israel was the venue that Vance chose. He gave us the speech at a place called the Quincy Institute. Now, that name may not mean much to many listeners, but it's a think tank that has been associated for a long time with hostility to Israel. One of its senior people wrote a book a decade and a half ago in which he suggested that American foreign policy was masterminded by a sinister Jewish lobby. Its executive vice president is someone who's been a long time leading friend and exponent of the point of view of the Iranian regime. It's not a place you go normally to declare friendship for Israel. That would be, you would say, it's a very strange choice for a Republican senator. Why didn't he go to the Hudson Institute, where Mike Pompeo is a fellow? Why didn't he go to the American Enterprise Institute? Why didn't he go, if he wanted a more neutral platform, to the Brookings Institution? So someplace that's sort of an intermediate place, but very prestigious. Why didn't he speak at a university, at Ohio State or at Notre Dame, or at University of Maryland? He chose the place that is most institutionally affiliated in Washington with hostility to Israel. And I think the suspicion that I have is he went there because he knew that the questions that might follow would not be uncomfortable. And the way the questions, if he went to Hudson or AEI or Ohio State, might get uncomfortable. So that's going to be question one. The other domestic ramifications is obviously this is happening under the Biden administration with a lot of permission from President Biden. It's a chance for Vice President Harris, again, who doesn't have a lot of foreign policy record, to speak firmly and clearly about what the U.S.-Israel relationship would look like if she is leader of the United States. And then with Donald Trump, we have someone who has certainly said very supportive things about Israel, but has had some very strange things to say about Iran and Hezbollah, including that he wants to make a deal with Iran.
So my you know more about this than I do. My gut is that probably both candidates tonight will be pro-Israel, present themselves as pro-Israel, even though they may not really be as, forthright as we might want. But having said that, it feels like this is more fraught for Harris and Vance, partly because a Democrat is currently the president, and partly because the possibility of this being a wedge issue for them, where if they are perceived as too pro-Israel, then maybe they're afraid that hurts them. I don't know, in Michigan. Whereas I don't really see a downside if Vance comes out, full-throated support of Israel. I don't see a downside for him to do that.
Well, first, everyone who speaks today has to be aware that they're going to have to wear these words in 48 or 72 hours, because in April, Iran launched a big barrage against Israel. And Israel, by and large, did not retaliate. Certainly not. I mean, they did some things at the periphery. They hit Iranian clients in Yemen, but mostly Israel let the punch go unanswered. This punch cannot. It's so massive. It's launched. It's launched from Iranian territory, not by a proxy, but by the Iranian state, intended to overwhelm Israeli air defenses. If human life is spared in Israel, it will only be because of the skill and vigilance of Israel defenders, not because of any restraint by the Iranians. So something is coming in the next 48 to 72 hours, and it will probably be quite devastating. So anything you say today, if you're any of the four candidates, you will have to be responsible for in the aftermath of whatever Israeli retaliation is coming. There's also a question of how supportive is the United States in these next 48 to 72 hours. Are there joint Israeli-U.S. operations? Does the United States take some kind of measure of retaliation? And again, if you're Vance and Trump, you have no control over that. But again, you're responsible for whatever happens. American public opinion has, depending on how you poll it, is somewhere 2-1 to 3-1 on Israel's side. And while there's a lot of talk about Arab and Muslim voters in Michigan, who have a very wide variety of political views, of course, not everyone will be supportive of the Iranian regime. Probably many will not. But there are also about somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 Jews in Pennsylvania, and many, many friends of Israel in Pennsylvania. And being weak on foreign policy is always more of a disadvantage in the United States than being strong.
I don't think this is fair, but Donald Trump has presented that the idea that the world is on fire, and that it's America's perceived as weak, Joe Biden's perceived as weak, and so we have all these, Russia invades Ukraine. Wouldn't have happened if Trump was president, right? And now what's happening in the Middle East doesn't. It seems to me that anything bad that happens in the world somehow helps Trump or benefits Trump. Yeah. Maybe that's paranoid, but what do you think of that theory?
Well, look, it is true that the president of the day wears the troubles and triumphs of the United States. Where there are successes, the president gets the credit, whether the president deserves it or not, and where there are troubles, the president gets the blame, whether the president deserves it or not. But so yes, if Israel, if this barrage is deflected, if Israel triumphantly retaliates against Iran in a way that is both devastating but not too costly in human life, then I think Biden gets the credit for that because he has been a good friend to the state of Israel. And if Kamala Harris speaks forthrightly on behalf of Israel, she'll get the credit too. But I want to say something about this image that Donald Trump presents. So the Russians invaded Ukraine in the year 2014 during the Obama administration. Conflict proceeded nonstop from 2014 to 2002 when the Russians made their lunge at Kiev. It was not true that there was peace in the region. It was just that Trump was basically on Russia's side. And while the United States sent Ukraine some weapons, not enough, it was in the Russians were building this operation during the Trump presidency, and they're building toward it in part because Ukraine was undersupported, because they saw President Trump blackmailing Ukraine that he would deny weapons unless Ukraine manufactured political dirt against Joe Biden. In the same way, in the Middle East, Hamas, the October 7th operation, was not prepared in a week, a month, a year. They have been building those tunnels for years. They're building them under Trump. There have been these constant clashes and conflicts. So I think it would be much more accurate to say not that there was peace in the world under Donald Trump, but because of the feckless, careless, corrupt, looking for foreign benefit administration of Donald Trump, every problem in the world was allowed to fester and then await resolution. So we now have a much more vigorous American response. One more thing that needs to be said here. Donald Trump always thought of America's system of alliances as a problem. The real enemies, in his view, were always Germany and Japan. And South Korea. They were the sources of all the problems. Russia, of course, was his friend, and China was someone he wanted to do business with and did do business with in a personal way. The United States is stronger because of its system of alliances, and those are all much more intact today than they were 5 years ago. And obviously, we have a lot to do to make sure that it's an effective network. But the beginning of wisdom is to understand that the United States is strong because its friends are strong.
I may title this one Wars, Hurricanes, and Strikes, because it does seem like there are three, at least, I don't know, big things happening right now that could impact the presidential race. And we had this hurricane, is it Helene pronounced, which of course hit Georgia, a important state, but I think North Carolina, which maybe isn't ready for it.
Well, I don't know if
some of the pictures and images we're seeing are pretty horrific.
I don't know if Asheville is literally the highest point in North Carolina, but if not literally the highest, it's the nearest. You would be well based if you lived in Asheville to think, flooding is not going to be a problem.
So I don't need flood insurance, right?
I don't need flood insurance because I'm on top of a mountain. And then this horrific act of God. I mean, those poor people. I mean, there's so many heartrending photographs. There's one I saw that showed a pair of grandparents just before they were lost while trying to rescue, I believe, their grandchild. I mean, it's so affecting. It's so devastating. I don't think there's yet an exact count of how many lives have been lost, but obviously very, very many. And it's just, and again,
I think over 100 I saw this morning.
And people probably who didn't have, and the way I'm sure that people who there are many parts of Florida where you have a hurricane plan, you have an evacuation route, you know what supplies to install. I imagine if you live in upcountry North Carolina, you don't think that way.
So North Carolina could be a very important state. I hate to bring this back to politics, but that's kind of what we do here.
Yeah.
We're so close to the election. Does this, or maybe it matters how the response is. If Biden has a...
Look, everyone knows that the president is not responsible for hurricanes. The question is the president compassionate? Is the president present? Does assistance come promptly and effectively? That was why Katrina was so devastating for George W. Bush. As fairly or not, people thought he seemed remote from the disaster when it happened, and then the response seemed ineffective when it happened. And again, a lot of that was not his fault. It was the fault of the state. But still, you're the head of the country. People want to know, what are you doing? So if the response is immediately effective, I think that probably redounds to the president's benefit. There's a big hurricane that struck New Jersey in 2012, and the Obama administration was on the scene immediately and with massive help, and people noticed. So is the question: is this Hurricane Sandy, which I think was the name of the New Jersey hurricane, or is it Hurricane Katrina?
Yeah. And then, of course, we have dock workers in the East Coast and the Gulf Coast who are
Yeah,
striking, and this could have certainly exacerbate inflation, I would think.
yeah. Well, it's also this is one that is potentially, I think, very dangerous for the Biden administration because Biden has been a pro-labor president. He said just today that he opposed the Taft-Hartley Act of 1946, and this is a particularly indefensible labor act. I mean, the American ports already have very low productivity compared to peer democracies. And they have low productivity because of late adoption of technologies. The dock workers are striking against the introduction of more technologies. And that's like when people strike over healthcare benefits or over wages or over safety, I think everybody understands that those are, of course, whether you're exactly right and whether management has its point of view, but the point is we would all do the same in their shoes. Of course, you want better health coverage. Of course, you want higher wages. And of course, you want a safe working environment. But when you're saying we are striking to maintain America's bottom of the pack rating in the efficiency of its ports, no, no, that can't. The ports have to work. They have to work as well as they do in Japan and Germany and the Netherlands. There's no basis for saying we reject modern technology in ports. Or anyway, you're not going to find a lot of sympathizers for that. And if Biden gets back into the I'm for on the waterfront approach to unshoring boats, that is damaging to him, I think.
All right. Well, before and probably keep this one short and sweet since it is a crazy day, and I'd like to get this up before the vice presidential debate so people can get your take as they watch it. But before we get to the Veep debate, I just want to go broad for a second and talk about the presidential race, writ large. Like, where are we today? I mean, I'll just say it seems like the race is tied. I think if I had to bet, bet on Kamala Harris, but it depends what poll you're looking at and which of these swing states. And it blows me away if you consider, by so many counts, the economy is doing very well. Unemployment rate is low. The Fed's lowering interest rates, all these things, all these that ought to be maybe helping Kamala Harris. You've got Donald Trump continuing to say just insane things on the reg. And yet, it's tied. It blows me away. But from your standpoint, where is the race today?
Well, I don't think it's tied in the sense that if the vote race were today, the vote would be the same. If the race were today, I think Harris would beat Trump by at least 7 million votes and probably more. That's not how politics is done in the United States.
Yeah.
But I think we all need to begin by thinking how strange it is that you can, we always, those of us who are of a certain age can remember discussing it as a theoretical possibility that the popular vote total and the electoral vote total could diverge. But between the 1880s and the year 2000, it just never happened. 120 years, it never happened. And you grew up thinking, as I did. I mean, again, it was an interesting theoretical possibility and would raise some fascinating problems should it ever occur, but of course it never would. Then it happened in 2000. But then the popular vote was exceedingly close. I think 300,000 votes between Bush and Gore nationwide, and an electorate with, more than 100 million cast. That's a statistical time. And so then the Electoral College did its thing, and you say, okay, that's odd and maybe unhealthy, but it's a freak of nature. It won't happen again. Now, it happened again in 2016, this time not by 300,000, but by 3 million votes. And it's poised to happen again in 2024. I personally think the margin will be too big for the Electoral College to override, but it could happen. And that will be a very strenuous and difficult situation. One thing that is going on that is worth commenting on is something that would normally be a positive, which is we are seeing the receding of race as a voting factor. That there was this theory that we were going to have people 20 years ago predicted an electorate polarized between whites and non-whites. In fact, what we're seeing is the most recent immigrants, especially Latino and especially men, are voting more like other young men who are similar to them. And you would normally say, okay, that's a sign that the American melting pot continues to bubble. It just happens in this case to bubble in a way that produces a lot of toil and trouble.
Well, it's so weird for someone like me too, who I've been a conservative Republican my whole life, and really was concerned about having efforts to do outreach, say to
Yeah,
Hispanics, and by crafting compassionate policies or speaking Spanish or whatever. There
yeah,
were ideas of how you could kind of win over
yeah.
some of these voters, and the idea that Trump is the one, like,
Yeah.
um,
Well, this may be
it,
a
it,
moment.
and I mean, there are theories, right? One argument could be maybe he's perceived as just cooler and less square, like, than Republicans, or maybe it's just the fact that like working class voters are going his direction regardless of ethnicity. But it does strike me as weird, like, you guys, we've been wooing these different voters for so long, and
Yeah.
Trump's the one.
Well, um, let's look at consequences before we look at causes. Uh, that the American party system is a little bit like an earthquake zone. You've got the two tectonic plates, and they're locked in place for long periods of time. And then something happens, and they slip, and there's an earthquake, and the plates move around in radically different ways. And the last time this happened in a big way was 1968 to 1974. So where the states that were the most loyally Democratic in 1966, the southern states, are by 1976 well on their way, if not firmly, into the Republican camp. And the states that were most Republican, New England, become the most Democratic. Remember, it was Maine and Vermont that delivered the vote that stood against Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936. Vermont is now the most liberal state in the nation. And so what happened was what it meant to be a Republican and what it meant to be a Democrat changed in 6 years, from 68 to 74, faster than they had changed in the 50 years before or the 50 years after. And we may be at a point like that now. I'm in contact with a lot of alumni of the George W. Bush administration and a lot of people from the Romney campaign. And I am startled at how many of them are now heart and soul on the Harris camp. Some of them, they're giving money, they're campaigning, because they don't love the Harris economic agenda at all. But their issues are clean government, constitutional government, support for allies, support for Ukraine, support for Israel, and just generally not being an asshole to the American people. And there, so you have this group of people who are sort of on their, who are like the way New England departed the Republican camp in 68 for the Democratic camp by 74 over Vietnam and Watergate and civil rights. Something like that may be happening now. And so those of us who were conservative on one side of this earthquake may find ourselves living in a whole different landscape, do find ourselves living in a whole different landscape on the other side. And we've all had to think about, there used to be, so when I was young, there are a bunch of things that went together very naturally. And then in the Trump era, they suddenly stopped going together naturally. And you have to think, well, which do I care more about? Do I care more about alliances, or do I care more about standing up to the liberals? Do I care more about abortion, or do I care more about trade? And you didn't have to separate them before, but now you do. And so we've all had to discover, it's been a fascinating process, what are the 2 and 3 and 4 most important issues to you? Because they push you in different directions from the way they might have 20 years before. And honestly, for me, the issues are, I wouldn't have put it as bluntly as this 15 years ago because I didn't have to. But if I have to choose, question 1, collective security, alliances. Who's standing up for America's role in the world? And question 2, who's protecting the world trading system? Open international trade. And then I've got a bunch of things out. And obviously, support for the Constitution and not making coups d'etat. And so what I really hope is we get through this election, Trump is defeated, and the Republican Party somehow comes to its senses. But I increasingly, I think that's just like wishing to reset the clock. It's not going to be that. And
Trump might not even go. Even if Trump loses, he might not go away. There's no.
Or Bobby Kennedy Jr. may be the next leader of the Republican Party. But see, if you think that what they're looking for is just someone who's authentically angry at everybody, he seems pretty angry.
Well, what's interesting, and I'll go back to like the Hispanic vote, for example, is while people like Trump were demagoguing immigration and warning that, you know, these are rapists and murderers and all that. And by the way, they're all going to vote Democratic. That was the thing. You import all these people, they're all going to vote Democratic. I was saying, well, they're probably going to be like, eventually, they're probably going to be like other waves of immigrants who, as they become more prosperous, many of them are going to become Republicans. And so you don't have to worry about them being like, you know, a unanimous Democratic vote. And I turned out to be right on that, which is weird.
Yeah, no, I always thought that emerging Democratic majority thesis was silly for this reason, a little more historical. So the history of American immigration is that different immigrant groups arrive in the same places and find themselves in political competition with one another. And the most classic example of this is Italians arriving in large numbers in the beginning of the 1880s. And they arrived in places where Irish immigrants and German immigrants had arrived in the 1840s. And the Irish and Germans had basically made a series of treaties about dividing up political power. And by the way, bishoprics in the Roman Catholic Church. There was some formula where they agreed how many bishops would be Irish and how many would be German. And if I remember this right, the first Italian-American bishop doesn't get appointed until the 1950s. Because the Germans and the Italians and Irish, neither of them will give up any of the bishops that are historically assigned to their group. So the Italians have to wait. So what do the Italians do? I say, well, look, here we are in New York or Philadelphia, Baltimore, and the Democratic Party is run by the Irish and Germans and their interests. And the Republican Party is empty. We'll take that over. And so in the 50s and 60s, you saw so many important urban Republican politicians had Italian names, not because they were against the New Deal, but because when they arrived in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York and Boston, the Democratic Party wouldn't carve out sufficient space for them sufficiently rapidly. And so they took over the other party.
Yeah.
And I thought that's going to happen with other ways.
Yeah.
That the Democratic Party is going to find itself, it will not have enough city council seats to accommodate all the ambitious people from all of these different groups. And so some of them will end up as Republicans.
I mean, think of it this way. If you were, you know, an ambitious African-American man right now, and by the way, like, there's a lot of political opportunists. The story is that Bob Dole became a Republican in Kansas because he went down to the courthouse and they said there's more Republicans in Kansas or something like that. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but so this is, you know, everybody kind of is sometimes guilty of this. But if you were an ambitious African American who wanted to get into politics today, it feels like you might have a better future actually in the Republican Party. And there's not this stigma attached. And this is a weird thing about Trump. There used to be a stigma attached. If you were a Black Republican, you were seen like kind of as a sellout or as an Uncle Tom or something like that. And I think that for whatever reason, Trump has, for better or worse, changed that.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's that stigma anymore that you lose your street cred by supporting Trump.
And I think most of the swing is happening. I don't believe there's a big swing to Trump among Black Americans because I think he is too offensive to them. But you certainly do see it among male Latinos. And part of it is what we're just seeing, and this is one of my master theses about American politics, is that in the 21st century, sexual divides are becoming more important than ethnic divides. I mean, always bracketing African Americans as a special historical case. That men and women are voting more and more differently from one another, especially young men and young women. Whereas young men and of different ethnic groups are voting more and more aligned. And again, you might say, in any other context, that's something of a success. It shows the American melting pot does bubble. But meanwhile, because because the media are so horrified by Trump, or the prestige media, we tend to focus on the Republican gains because we find that the hard thing to explain. But meanwhile, you know, the congressional seats that used to be some of the safest Republican seats in the country. And I always use the example of Texas 7, which is, I think, the most in the area of Houston near Rice University and the Art Museum. So George H.W. Bush wins Texas 7 in 1966. And it stays Republican through Watergate, through Iran-Contra, through the Iraq War, and it goes Democratic in 2018. and has stayed Democratic ever since. Because the kind of person who lives in the vicinity of the Houston Art Museum and Rice University, who used to be, they not only that person, but everyone in the household, the women as well as the men, the young people, they were all Republicans for, they were prosperous, practical people who wanted clean government and didn't, were much more worried about what they paid for government than what they got for government. So they were Republicans. And then Trump comes along and they say, no way, absolutely,
Yeah.
no. And they start voting Democratic.
I feel their pain.
Eric Cantor's district in Richmond solidly has been Democratic, went Democrat in 2018, stayed that way. Newt Gingrich's district went Democrat in 2018 and stayed that way. And so the question of, these movements are happening everywhere, and we are seeing a remaking of American politics where sex and education are maybe even exceeding race and ethnicity as drivers of how people vote.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a healthy thing and a good thing that, I think it's bad if I can look at your race and predict what party you're in. That's probably not great. But the sexual divide is
alarming in its own way.
Maybe even more dangerous, right? Because the future of mankind depends upon men and women getting together.
Yeah. And as politics becomes more salient, I mean, you do hear a lot from young men and young women that it's a real problem in their their dating lives.
Yeah.
And I mean, my wife and I have voted the same way. We were married in 1988. We voted in the same way in every election since then, with two exceptions. And the first exception was 2008 when I voted for McCain and she voted for Obama. And she said to me, "Do you want to tell the grandchildren that you voted against the first black president, or shall I?" That was, but I dearly love McCain, so I had to stay true.
That is great. All right, well, we should probably end with the vice presidential debate. Now, just hours away, we have hinted a little bit at it, but what are you going to be watching? What might be the storyline, or doesn't matter? Vice presidential races or debates don't matter.
I think in this case it does matter. And it's going to matter a lot. First, the race is on a knife edge, so everything matters. Second, as would have been true when Biden was on the Democratic ticket, the Republican nominee is really old and visibly declining. There is a good chance that the person debating for the Republicans tonight if Trump wins, if the Trump-Vance ticket wins, that may be your next president, and quite soon. So, of course, it matters. And I just genuinely think as we become more politically aware as society, one of the reasons we're more polarized is because we're so much better informed than our grandparents were. And that I think it will matter. And I think the first question, which I assume will be on the Middle East, possibly on the hurricane, Vance will have the advantage because he's just a better informed. He's a better informed person than Waltz. He thinks faster than Waltz. And he will have the advantage of just being nimbler on his feet and having more resources of information to draw on. On the other hand, he is a uniquely off-putting personality. I think CNN this morning had a survey that found not only does he have the highest net unfavorables of anybody in this race, but he has the highest net unfavorables of any candidate for vice president ever. So there is that. And Waltz, pretty liberal, and he was governor of Minnesota during the civil unrest of 2020, so he has that to answer for, but he just looks like a kind of figure that Americans have, the best high school teacher in your high school, the guy who volunteers time to support every team. People have met that guy, they like that guy, and they know what he is, even if he sometimes has some ideas that are a little kooky.
So it sounds like, just to sort of sum up what you said, Vance, sharper, more knowledgeable on policy, Walz more likable, more folksy, and that's going to be what it's about.
I think there's one more thing, which is Vance. There's this undercurrent to Vance that is just unpleasant and threatening. Like, let me give you his most famous comment is the childless cat lady comment. let me rephrase this for you. We have a lot of data that shows that Americans of childbearing age are having fewer children than they themselves say they want. And it's a gap of as many as, it's a gap. And the people who express this disappointment and heartache most intensely are American women. Now, those of us who had children know that this is the greatest joy and satisfaction in life. And we seem to have developed ways of organizing our society that are depriving Americans of this greatest of joy and satisfactions. Isn't there something we could do that would put, and here are some ideas. Here's a list of ideas that I have that would help Americans. And like 90% of people would say, even if I don't love all of those ideas you've just mentioned, that seems like a reasonable thing to care about. You seem like a family-focused person. You seem to have your priorities straight. You seem like someone that would be good to have as a neighbor. So how do you take the thought, we should help Americans have the children they want? They say that they tell us that they want and aren't having. How do you make that threatening and nasty and unpleasant and an attack on American women? What kind of person converts the most wholesome of thoughts into the most ugly of expressions? And that happens again and again, that you take something that is not such a bizarre thing necessarily to believe, and makes it really nasty. And why?
And I think that undermines.
Where does that come from?
And I think that also undermines conservatism. Like, you might actually be a conservative person who has pro-natalist policies, and now he has basically made those toxic. You might have had very legitimate, defensible ideas about encouraging Americans to have more kids and subsidizing that, but now he's made that poisonous.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I completely share that. So here's, we should, instead of tax credits, which arrive once a year, what if you had cash deposits that arrived every month? What if you had a more generous women, infant, and children nutrition program? What if states and cities organized, found a way to put clinics into vans and sent them into neighborhoods, so that the clinic came to people, it came to them on the weekend, not just during the week, so that if you had a child with an earache, you didn't have to go to the clinic came to you. You could write a roster of these things. And again, some of them may not be such great ideas. Some of them may be fantastic ideas, but no one would perceive them as threatening, even if some of them look maybe expensive. So those are and I listen to him and I think, God, I'm not for that. I'm wherever that comes from. We would probably overlap a lot on what we think we should actually do. But wherever that is coming from, it is not a healthy place in the heart and soul for an idea to come from.
Do you think that's him, or is that him responding to incentives? I think
that's a profound question.
Yeah.
I think there is definitely a subculture of which he's a part, where there's a big problem and a little problem. The little problem is the podcast culture of that group rewards putting things in the edgiest, meaning nastiest way possible. But I think there definitely is a kind of extinction of the white race fear that drives the politics of a lot of not just bloggers, but some very, very wealthy and powerful people. And I think that's his real milieu is not weirdo podcast. His real worldview is the person who's writing the checks to make all of this possible. And that constituency is very eager for what he has to say, even if it's politically harmful in anywhere where the people who vote who don't have billions of dollars.
Indeed. Well, we will be watching tonight. Anything I missed? Any final thoughts before we let you go?
Well, we're all hoping for peaceful outcomes in Ukraine and Israel. What is happening in Israel? My heart is on edge, and it is a reminder of what a dangerous and violent world this would be without American leadership, and a reminder of the indispensability of American leadership to preserve peace and security and freedom.
All right, indeed, David Frum, always a pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the show.